And in fact, economists have run through a number of sort of standard cases where a voluntary market, some sense of voluntary market arrangement, at least an ordinary arrangement, leads to undesirable results. One standard example, which I mentioned a few minutes ago, is the public good problem. What's a public good to an economist? A public good is a good such that the person who produces it can't control who gets it. So the way I usually define it is it's a good such that if produced at all, it will be available to all the members of a pre-existing group of people. And to point out that that could be just a feature of the good, not a matter of what the law is, consider a radio broadcast. Prior to the technologies of cable and encryption, if I put out a radio broadcast, everybody within a certain distance of my antenna can listen to it, and I can't go to the individual listener and say, if you don't pay me for the right to listen to the broadcast, you can't listen to it. All right? And that raises a problem, and the problem is, how do I pay for my broadcast? The general problem for a public good is the way we usually get goods produced is the producer says to the person who wants the good, you may have the good only if you will pay me a sum of money which is enough so I'm willing to produce the good and not enough so you're not willing to pay it. All right? And the nice thing about that system, waving away a whole lot of price theory and complications, is that if a good is worth producing, then I will find the people that are willing to pay me enough to get it produced. If it's not worth producing, they won't. That looks like a nice, efficient, desirable, rational kind of outcome. Doesn't work for a public good. For the public good, it might be that the broadcast, the value to the consumers of that broadcast was considerably larger than the cost of putting it on, but I can't get them to pay that value because each individual consumer correctly says whether I pay won't determine whether the broadcast happens. If it happens, I get to listen to it. Now, there are a variety of imperfect solutions to the public good problem. If the public is small enough, if you're talking about something which benefits 8 people rather than 100,000, the 8 people might be able to get together and say, look, I'll chip in money only if you'll chip in money and he chips in money and so forth, what I think of as unanimous contract solution. Each person says, well, if I don't agree, we're not going to get the good because the others will only put in the money if I do. The amount of money I'm putting in is less than the value of the good to me, so we get the good. And there are a number of other solutions. I won't run through the standard list. But they all have the characteristic that they're imperfect, meaning you will sometimes be able to get public goods that are worth their cost of production, but there will be some public goods which are worth their cost of production and don't get produced. A further characteristic that's common to at least some of the solutions is they're easier with small publics. And they're easier with organized publics. So if you have 8 people who are already doing stuff together, know each other, have a bunch of deals, families say, it's a lot easier to get that group of 8 people to agree than 8 strangers. So that's the public good problem, and that's some of the possible solutions. Notice that this is not the same thing as a good produced by the government. That the post office produces a private good, because the post office can choose not to deliver your mail if there's no stamp on it. Public schools, for the most part, produce a private good. You might think it's a private bad in some cases. The logic of the problem doesn't really depend on that, because they could choose not to let your kid attend if they wanted. All right? So those are not public goods in the economist's sense. They're goods where the producer can control them. And again, I'm oversimplifying a little, but not, I think, too much for my purpose. On the other hand, there are lots of public goods that are produced privately. At this very instant, I would like to believe I am producing a public good, because I would like to believe that if all of you go away from this talk understanding the ideas I'm trying to explain, you will spread those ideas through the world. That will slightly, very, very slightly benefit all of us by making an attractive future more likely. If so, then I'm producing a public good. To take a less controversial, perhaps, example, let's go back to that radio broadcast. Despite the fact that it's obviously impossible, radio broadcasts are produced privately. And they're produced privately because some, to me, unknown genius came up with the idea of producing not one public good, but 2. You have one public good which has a positive cost of production and a positive value to the consumer, and that's called a radio program. And you have a second public good that has a negative cost of production and a negative value to the consumer, and that's called an advertisement. And you tie the two tightly together and give away the package. And the negative cost of production is because advertisers will pay you to put on their ads, and that covers the positive cost of the program. So that's an example of a case where a sufficiently clever person could find a way around the problem and get the good produced. And in fact, I like to argue that one of the things that market failure in general, including public good problems, can also be thought of is as a profit opportunity. Because what's happening where you're having market failure is that if somehow you could change things, total benefits would be larger than total costs. So maybe if you're clever enough, you can figure out a way of doing it in which you get to pocket some part of the difference between benefits and costs, as in those examples. But again, there's no guarantee. And you ought to expect that even in the ideal society we would like to see, with government entirely out of the way and individuals freely transacting, there will be some things worth doing that aren't done due to problems such as the public good problem. There are a variety of other examples of market solutions to problems of this sort. Another standard market failure problem is what's called an externality. The externality is the case where my action, in addition to its effect on me, is producing either benefits or costs to other people. If they're benefits, I can't control whether you get them. If costs, you can't stop me from imposing them. That, again, partly depends on the legal rules of the society, but partly is just a characteristic of the good. And there again, there are sometimes solutions. There happens to be a case which is famous in the literature because it was a case of a good economist making an incorrect prediction. Indeed, an incorrect description of reality as a result of not bothering to look at it. And this is the case of bees and flowers. Bees browse on flowers. If you want to produce honey, you've got to have blooming flowers for your bees to get nectar from. And an economist who, oddly enough, was named Mead, who actually was quite a well-known economist, he got a Nobel Prize for work on trade theory, at some point discussing the externality problem says, look, as an example of the kind of externality problem you couldn't expect to solve privately, think about the relation between people who raise bees and people who raise crops. That bees are no respecters of property lines. So you can't have the farmer say to the bees, you may only fly onto my field and harvest nectar from my crop if you or your owner pays me an appropriate fee for doing that. Therefore, he said, the farmers have an insufficient incentive to grow those crops that will do a good job of making honey, and you will therefore have an inefficient outcome. And some economists got interested in this, and they actually researched the honey industry. And it turns out that what he had been claiming was impossible had been standard practice in the industry for a century or so, which was as far back as they had records. Because although it's true that bees do not respect property lines, it's also true that bees, like the rest of us, are lazy. And they like to harvest from the closest possible crop. And it's therefore been standard practice for a long time that when the relevant crops are in bloom, the apiarists pay the farmers for permission to put their hives in the middle of the field, which then results in those bees getting the honey. It turned out there was a second externality that Mead had missed, which is that at a different point in the growing cycle, the bees are pollinating the crop and therefore increasing crop yield. And so it turns out that there were also contracts at a different time in the year when the farmers paid the apiarists to put their hives in the middle of the field. So it was sort of a neat example where Mead had a legitimate theoretical point, and yet it turned out that human ingenuity in this case and bees' laziness had solved the problem. So the conclusion is that this is a legitimate critique of laissez-faire. This does imply that there will be things worth doing that don't get done. In that sense, the people who are arguing with us are right. Although it is a less powerful critique than it at first seems, because there are a variety of ways around it.